Before we prepare for takeoff on this chilling journey, please make sure your seatbelt is fastened, your tray table is in its upright position, and you've clicked that subscribe button and rung the notification bell. You won't want to experience any turbulence on this flight of discovery. Now, settle in and prepare for a tale of impossible crimes and the monster who hid in the cockpit. This is the harrowing case of the ghost flights. The problem began as a statistical impossibility, a ghost in the meticulous, data-driven machine of modern air travel. It wasn't a crash or a hijacking, nothing so visceral or immediate. It was something far stranger, something that whispered of the impossible. On 4 separate occasions over 6 months, a passenger on Oceanic Air's Flight 815 from the bustling metropolis of Northgate to the sun-drenched coastal city of San Viento had vanished. They didn't miss their flight. Their boarding passes were scanned, their presence confirmed on the manifest. They were often seen by fellow passengers finding their seat, stowing their luggage, and settling in for the 5-hour journey. But when the plane landed and the cabin doors opened in San Viento, they were gone. Their seat was empty. Their carry-on luggage remained in the overhead bin. There was no sign of a struggle, no witnesses who saw anything unusual. They had simply ceased to be. The first time it happened, with a businessman named Robert Anderson, it was dismissed as a bizarre fluke. The airline and the authorities theorized he had somehow disembarked during boarding without being noticed, a glaring but plausible security lapse. The second time, 3 months later, with a young student named Chloe Davis, alarm bells began to ring. By the third disappearance, a retired librarian named Martha Gable, the word impossible, was being whispered in the hushed, frantic meetings between the airline, the FAA, and federal law enforcement. This was when Detective Isabella, Izzy Rossi, and her partner, Detective Marcus Thorne, were brought in. Their unit, specializing in complex, atypical homicides, was loaned to the FBI task force assigned to the case. The FBI handled the federal jurisdiction, but they needed thinkers, investigators who could look at a perfectly sealed aluminum tube flying at 500 miles per hour and figure out how a human being could simply fall out of it. A locked room mystery at 30,000 feet, Thorne grumbled as they sat through their initial briefing, looking at the faces of the 3 missing people projected on a large screen. I hate locked room mysteries. They always end with some ridiculous explanation that makes me want to throw the case file out a window. Izzy, however, was intrigued. The sheer impossibility of the crime was a challenge that appealed to her analytical mind. She absorbed every detail. The aircraft was always an Airbus A320. The disappearances occurred on the same flight number, and there was no discernible link between the victims. Robert Anderson was a high-flying corporate raider. Chloe Davis was a backpacker on a budget. Martha Gable was a grandmother on her way to visit her family. They were different ages, from different backgrounds, and sat in different seats on their respective flights. The only thing they had in common was their shared, inexplicable fate. The crew has been interviewed a dozen times. The lead FBI agent, a stern man named Harker, explained. The same senior crew works this route on a regular rotation. 2 pilots for flight attendants. All of them have spotless records. They're as baffled as we are. They work a flight, everything seems normal, they land, and they're short 1 passenger. It's like counting cattle and coming up 1 shy, except the pasture is a pressurized cabin 6 miles high. Their first task was to interview the flight crew again, not as suspects, but as the only consistent witnesses to a series of impossible events. The interviews took place in a sterile conference room at the Oceanic Air corporate headquarters. The flight attendants were professional, anxious, and visibly shaken. They recounted the normal hum of a routine flight, the safety demonstration, the drink service, the quiet dimming of the cabin lights for the long stretch over the desolate Sierra Madre Mountains. None of them remembered anything out of the ordinary. They had passed the victims' seats multiple times during the flight and had noticed nothing amiss. Then came the pilots. The co-pilot was a young, eager aviator who seemed overwhelmed by the situation. The captain, however, was a different story. His name was Captain Julian Croft. He was in his late 40s, with a calm, commanding presence that instantly filled the room. He had the kind of reassuring, weathered face, and steady blue eyes that passengers see in airline commercials. He was a 20-year veteran of the airline, a former Air Force pilot with thousands of hours of flight time and a reputation for being one of the best in the business. He was grace under pressure personified. "Detectives," he said, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. "I've gone over these flights in my mind 1,000 times. We've reviewed every second of the cockpit voice recorder, every data point from the flight data recorder. They were, by every technical measure, perfect flights. A perfect flight that someone disappears from," Thorne countered, his natural skepticism bristling at Croft's unflappable demeanor. "Doesn't that strike you as odd, Captain?" "It's more than odd, Detective. It's terrifying," Croft replied, his expression grave. "My first responsibility is the safety of every soul on that aircraft. The idea that someone can simply vanish from my plane under my command. It's a profound failure that I cannot explain." He was the perfect witness. He was articulate, concerned, and technically knowledgeable. He walked them through the aircraft's security features, the reinforced cockpit door, the inwardly opening cabin doors that were impossible to open mid-flight due to the immense pressure differential, the lack of any other viable exits. He spoke with the quiet authority of a man who was master of his domain. As he spoke, Izzy watched him, not just listening to his words, but studying their cadence. There was an almost preternatural calm about him, a complete lack of the nervous energy the flight attendants had shown. He wasn't just calm. He was serene, like a man discussing a complex but ultimately abstract problem, rather than a series of terrifying human disappearances. The fourth disappearance occurred a week later, turning the investigation into a full-blown public crisis. The victim was a young honeymooner, Mark Hudson. His new wife, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder, woke up as the plane began its descent into San Viento to find him gone. Her hysterical screams upon landing were the first that the other passengers knew that something was terribly wrong. The ghost flights of Flight 815 became a media sensation, a modern-day Bermuda Triangle. Public fear was rampant. Oceanic Air saw its bookings plummet. The pressure on the task force became immense. They had to find an answer. They grounded the specific aircraft used in the disappearances and tore it apart, panel by panel. Forensic teams swarmed over every inch of the cabin, searching for hidden compartments, secret hatches, or any sign of foul play. They found nothing. The plane was clean. Izzy became obsessed with the flight path. Flight 815's route took it over one of the most desolate and sparsely populated regions of the country. The vast, rugged expanse of the Great Basin Desert and the Sierra Madre mountain range. For a period of about 90 minutes, the plane was over a wilderness of jagged peaks, deep canyons, and alkali flats, an area so remote that radar coverage was spotty, and there were no major towns for hundreds of miles in any direction. If you wanted to make something disappear, Izzy mused, tracing the flight path on a large map in their incident room, this is where you'd do it. Out here, you could drop an elephant from 30,000 feet and no one would find it for a century. "Drop it how, Izzy?" Thorne retorted, exasperated. "We've been over this. You can't open a door. You can't open a window. The cargo hold is pressurized but inaccessible from the cabin. We've had aeronautical engineers tell us that short of a catastrophic explosion, there is no way for a person to exit that aircraft mid-flight." Frustrated, the investigators turned their focus back to the victims. They built deep profiles of the 4 missing passengers, searching for any possible connection. They looked for links to organized crime, terrorism, secret government programs, anything that might explain their extraordinary disappearance. They found nothing. The 4 victims were, by all accounts, completely ordinary people. Their lives were an open book, and nothing in those books suggested they were the type of people who would be the target of a mysterious, high-tech abduction. The only common denominator was Captain Julian Croft. He had been the pilot in command on all 4 flights. Statistically, with crew rotations, this was a significant anomaly. He became the task force's primary and only person of interest. They descended on his life, digging into his past with a ferocious intensity. What they found only deepened the mystery. Julian Croft was more than just a model pilot. He was a model citizen. He was a happily married father of two, a volunteer at his local church, a respected member of his suburban community. His finances were in order. He had no history of mental illness, no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. His colleagues revered him. His neighbors adored him. He was, by all accounts, a fundamentally good and stable man. Yet, Izzy couldn't shake the image of him from their interview, his unnerving calm, his intellectual detachment. It felt less like the reaction of a concerned professional and more like the calculated performance of a man who knew he was untouchable. She and Thorne went to interview him again, this time at his home. It was a beautiful, meticulously kept house in a quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac. They were greeted by his wife, a warm, friendly woman who expressed deep concern for her husband, whom she said was being unfairly scrutinized. They found Croft in his study, a room lined with books on aviation history, geography, and philosophy. A large, detailed map of the world covered one wall. He was calm, as always, but this time Izzy sensed a subtle shift. It was a flicker of intellectual pride, the quiet confidence of a master craftsman being asked to explain his work to a pair of novices. "Detectives, I've already told you everything I know," he said, gesturing for them to sit. "We're not here to talk about the flights, Captain," Izzy said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We're here to talk about you." She began to probe, asking him about his time in the Air Force, about his personal philosophy, about his view of the world from the cockpit. Croft was an eloquent and thoughtful speaker. He spoke of the beauty of the world from above, of the sense of order and peace he felt in the sky, high above the chaos of the world below. "Up there," he said, his eyes glazing over with a strange, distant light, "the world makes sense. You have physics, aerodynamics, meteorology. You have rules. You follow them, you are safe. You deviate, you are not. Down here, it's all just noise, randomness, chaos." He spoke with a detached, almost godlike perspective, the perspective of a man who spends his life looking down on the world. As he spoke, Izzy felt a profound chill. She was beginning to realize that they were not dealing with a conventional killer. The motive wasn't money, or revenge, or passion. It was something far more abstract and terrifying. She noticed a small, framed photograph on his desk, partially obscured by a stack of books. It was an old black and white photo of a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing proudly in front of a small propeller plane. The boy looked remarkably like a young Julian Croft. "Is that you?" Izzy asked, nodding toward the photo. Croft's serene expression tightened, just for a fraction of a second. "My brother," he said curtly. "He died a long time ago." He offered no more details, and the wall of calm composure went back up instantly. But Izzy had seen it. A crack, a brief, uncontrolled flicker of pain and something else. Something darker. They left the house with nothing new in terms of evidence, but with a fundamentally altered view of their suspect. The meticulous perfection of his life, his philosophical detachment, his obsession with order and control, it was all beginning to form a disturbing psychological portrait. They weren't just hunting a killer. They were hunting a philosopher, a man who had appointed himself the sole arbiter of a set of rules that only he understood. As they drove away, Izzy couldn't shake the captain's words. Randomness. Chaos. She had a terrifying thought. What if the victims weren't connected at all? What if they were chosen for the very fact that they were random? What if, to a man who craved order, the ultimate act of control was to impose his own final, deadly order on the chaos of human existence, one random soul at a time? The locked room was no longer the puzzle. The puzzle was the mind of the man who held the key. A man who could fly a plane full of people through a perfect, cloudless sky, while secretly plotting to make one of them disappear into the vast, indifferent void below. The investigation into the ghost flights of Captain Julian Croft entered a frustrating and stagnant phase. They had a compelling suspect, but not a single shred of physical evidence to link him to the disappearances. He was a ghost, his methods seemingly supernatural. The task force was at a breaking point, with federal authorities pushing for a resolution and the public's fear verging on hysteria. Oceanic Air, hemorrhaging money, had already replaced Croft and his crew on Flight 815, But the mystery remained, a dark cloud hanging over the airline industry. Thorne, a man who believed in tangible clues and brute force investigation, was hitting a wall of absolute perfection. He and his team conducted a forensic audit of Croft's entire life. They re-interviewed his wife, his children, his friends, his old Air Force colleagues. They analyzed his bank accounts, his credit card statements, his phone records, and his internet history. The result was a portrait of a man so impeccably normal it was in itself abnormal. He didn't have secret debts, clandestine affairs, or radical political views. He read books on philosophy, subscribed to aviation magazines, and planned family vacations to national parks. He was a suburban dad who just happened to be, in their theory, a serial killer who could make people vanish from airplanes. "It's a perfect cover," Thorne grumbled, throwing a thick file onto his desk. "Or he's the unluckiest son of a bitch in the world and is completely innocent. Right now, I can't tell which." Izzy, meanwhile, retreated into the one place where she believed the secret was hidden: the data. She was convinced that no matter how clever Croft was, he couldn't defy the laws of physics. There had to be a logistical explanation, a method, and that method had to have left a trace, however faint, in the vast streams of data that track a modern airliner. She practically moved into a secure room at the FAA's regional headquarters, a space filled with monitors displaying flight paths, weather patterns, and endless columns of telemetry. With the help of a grizzled, chain-smoking FAA analyst named Sal, she began to deconstruct the 4 ghost flights, second by second. They overlaid the flight data recorder information from the 4 flights. The black boxes showed that each flight was, as Croft had claimed, technically flawless. The planes flew their assigned routes at their assigned altitudes. The autopilot was engaged for the majority of the journey. There were no sudden deviations, no unexplained maneuvers. "He's right, Detective," Sal said, pointing to a synchronized playback on a screen. "These 4 flights are identical to the 100 other times he flew that route. The plane did exactly what it was supposed to do." "Then let's look at what the plane wasn't supposed to do," Izzy countered. "Let's look for the things the data doesn't show." They widened their search. They pulled in external data: satellite weather imagery, air traffic control communications from adjacent sectors, even seismic activity reports. For weeks, they found nothing. The flights were maddeningly, impossibly normal. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a sudden revelation but the slow emergence of a subtle, almost imperceptible pattern. Sal was running a comparative analysis of the cabin pressure logs. On most commercial flights, the cabin pressure is maintained at a steady, comfortable level with only minute, automated adjustments. But on each of the 4 ghost flights, Sal found a tiny anomaly. "Right here," he said, pointing to a small dip in a graph. For a period of about 90 seconds on each of these flights, there was a minor, and I mean minor, pressure fluctuation. Not enough to deploy the oxygen masks or trigger any alarms. Most people wouldn't even feel it, maybe a slight pop in the ears. It's the kind of thing the system would automatically correct in under 2 minutes. Izzy's heart began to beat faster. Where on the flight path did this happen? Sal cross-referenced the timestamps with the plane's GPS coordinates. He projected the location onto the large map of the flight path. The 4 points were not just in the same general area. They were within a few hundred yards of each other. The anomaly occurred every time the plane was over a specific, jagged, and utterly remote canyon system deep in the heart of the Sierra Madre wilderness, in the very center of the radar gap. "And there's more," Sal said, his excitement growing. He pulled up the cockpit voice recordings for those specific moments. On 3 of the 4 flights, at the exact time of the pressure drop, Captain Croft's voice could be heard. He made a calm, routine announcement to the passengers. "Folks, we're just hitting a small patch of unexpected light turbulence. Nothing to be concerned about. We'll have you through it in just a minute." They checked the corresponding weather satellite data. For each of the 4 flights, on those specific days and at those times, the skies over that canyon were perfectly clear. There was no atmospheric reason for any turbulence, however light. "He's creating a pretext," Izzy whispered, the pieces of the puzzle starting to slam into place in her mind. A 90-second window of expected bumps and odd feelings. a manufactured event to cover something else. But what? The pressure drop was still too small to indicate a cabin door opening. It was a dead end, a tantalizing clue that led nowhere. Disheartened, Izzy decided to revisit Croft's past, this time focusing on his Air Force career. She was still bothered by the curtness of his answer about his brother. She requested his full, unredacted military service record. Days later, a thick, classified file landed on her desk. Most of it was standard commendations and flight logs, but deep within the file, she found a report on a training accident. During a high-altitude, low-opening, halo parachute jump exercise, a young airman's equipment had malfunctioned. The airman was Julian Croft's younger brother, Daniel. The primary parachute failed to deploy, and the reserve chute became entangled. Daniel Croft had fallen to his death. The report concluded with a chilling detail. Due to the nature of the exercise, Daniel was carrying a specialized piece of equipment, a small, portable oxygen unit and a pressure mask designed for high-altitude jumps. The lead investigator of the accident noted that the younger Croft had been a meticulous and careful airman, and the double equipment failure was a statistical anomaly of the highest order. The official cause was listed as equipment malfunction, but a shadow of doubt hung over the report. Julian Croft, who was serving on the same base at the time, was granted compassionate leave and later honorably discharged. Izzy's blood ran cold. She felt like she had just found the source code for a monster. A brother, lost to a statistically anomalous equipment failure during a fall from the sky. A man who then dedicates his life to the perfect, orderly control of a machine that flies, who becomes obsessed with rules and the elimination of randomness. She dove into the schematics of the Airbus A320, the plane used on every ghost flight. She spent hours on the phone with aeronautical engineers, asking questions that seemed insane. She wasn't asking about the main cabin doors or the cargo hold. She was asking about the forgotten access points, the maintenance hatches, the small, obscure parts of the plane that no passenger ever sees. And then she found it, the aft outflow valve. It was a small, circular port at the very rear of the aircraft, part of the pressurization system. It was designed to regulate the cabin pressure by venting air out of the plane. It was located in the rear galley, behind a service panel that was usually locked. The valve itself was only about 20 inches in diameter, too small for a person to fit through. Usually. I asked the Airbus engineer if that valve could be modified, Izzy explained to a stunned Thorne and Agent Harker. He said it was impossible without triggering a dozen alarms. But then I asked him, what if you had access to the plane's maintenance logs? What if you were a senior pilot who could sign off on minor, undocumented repairs during overnight layovers? What if you could, over a period of months, subtly widen the valve's housing, disable the specific sensors that monitor it, and fashion a custom-built plug to seal it, a plug that you could remove and replace from the inside? The engineer had reluctantly admitted that it was, in theory, possible. It would require an expert knowledge of the plane's systems and an incredible amount of audacity. The pressure drop Sal had found would be consistent with briefly removing such a plug. It wouldn't be enough to cause a catastrophic depressurization, but it would be enough. The picture was now horrifyingly clear. Julian Croft wasn't just a pilot. He was a meticulous engineer of death. His method was a symphony of chilling precision. First, he chose his victim, seemingly at random, from the passenger manifest. During the long, dark flight over the desolate mountains, he would leave the cockpit, a routine and permissible action, go to the rear galley, and covertly drug his target, perhaps by offering them a complimentary drink laced with a powerful, fast-acting sedative. He would then move the incapacitated passenger to the rear galley under the guise of them being ill. Then, at the precise moment the plane crossed over his predetermined drop zone, the canyon system from his PADA would enact his plan. He would make the turbulence announcement to settle the other passengers and crew. In the privacy of the galley, he would open the concealed service panel, remove his custom plug from the modified outflow valve, creating a small, brief pressure change. And then, he would push the unconscious body of his victim through the 20-inch hole, sending them into the night sky. He would then replace the plug, seal the panel, and return to the cockpit. The entire event would take less than 2 minutes. He was replaying his brother's death over and over again. He wasn't just killing people. He was ritualistically sacrificing them to the altar of his own trauma, correcting the random, chaotic event that had defined his life. He was the one in control now. He was the one pushing people out of the plane, but this time it was by his design, on his terms. The random selection of his victims was his way of mocking the cruel randomness of the universe that had taken his brother. "My God!" Harker breathed, looking pale. "He turns the entire plane into a murder weapon. It's the perfect crime," Thorne added, his voice grim. "No witnesses, no evidence. A victim that's literally vanished into thin air. He would have gotten away with it forever. But they still had a problem. It was a brilliant, compelling, and utterly terrifying theory. But it was still just a theory. They had no modified valve, no custom plug, no bodies. To stop Croft, they couldn't just present a theory to a judge. They had to go into the desolate wilderness that haunted his past and find his graveyard in the sky. The theory, as brilliant and horrifying as it was, hung in the air like a ghost. To the FBI brass and the prosecutors, it was a piece of masterful detective work. But it was also a narrative, a story without a final chapter. There was no body, no weapon, no physical link. Julian Croft remained an untouchable phantom, a man protected by the sheer audacity and impossibility of his alleged crimes. Izzy knew they had only one move left. They had to find the ending to her story. They had to go into the wilderness. Organizing a search of the target area was a logistical nightmare. The canyon system lay in the heart of the Sierra Madre Range, a vast and unforgiving landscape of rock, sagebrush, and treacherous terrain, much of it designated as a national wilderness area, inaccessible by road. The drop zone Izzy had identified on the map was a 10-square-mile patch of this brutal geography. A massive, multi-agency operation was launched under a cloak of official secrecy, disguised as a wildfire prevention survey. Search and rescue teams, forensic anthropologists, and FBI agents were flown in by helicopter. For days, they scoured the canyons and mesas under the relentless desert sun. The search was grueling, the terrain punishing. As the days wore on with no results, hope began to fade. The pressure from Washington to abandon the wild goose chase was immense. Thorne began to doubt. Even Izzy felt her certainty wavering under the vast, empty sky. It was on the 5th day that a search team member, rappelling down a sheer canyon wall, found something. It wasn't a body. It was a small, tattered piece of fabric snagged on a thorny creosote bush about halfway down the cliff face. It was the corner of a floral print scarf. A quick check of the evidence logs confirmed it. The scarf matched the description of the one worn by the 3rd victim, the retired librarian Martha Gable. The discovery re-energized the search. The teams concentrated their efforts in the deep, winding canyon below the cliff. And there they found it. Tucked under a rocky overhang, partially concealed by a rock slide, was a scene of unimaginable horror. They found human remains. The high-altitude fall and the work of time and desert scavengers had left a grim, scattered tableau. But through dental records and DNA analysis, they were quickly identified. Robert Anderson, Chloe Davis, Martha Gable, Mark Hudson. They were all there. Croft's secret graveyard had been found. The discovery was a bombshell, but Croft had one more layer of protection. His high-powered attorney argued that while tragic, the discovery of the bodies proved nothing. There was no evidence to link Captain Croft to their deaths. It was a bizarre, unexplained phenomenon, but to accuse a decorated pilot of engineering such a fantastical crime was character assassination of the highest order. Izzy knew they needed one final piece to lock the case. The proof had to be on the plane. While Croft had been suspended from flying, the specific Airbus A320 he had so often captained was still in service, having been cleared by the initial forensic sweep. Under the pretext of a routine FAA safety inspection, Izzy, Thorne, and a team of specialized engineers from Airbus, who had been secretly flown in from France, boarded the aircraft at a secure hangar. They went straight to the rear galley. The lead engineer, a stoic Frenchman named Benoit, ran a hand over the service panel that concealed the outflow valve. On the surface, "It is perfect," he murmured. But he wasn't looking at the surface. He and his team used endoscopic cameras, ultrasonic scanners, and laser micrometers. After a tense hour, Benoit pointed to a hairline crack in a sealant strip, invisible to the naked eye. "Here," he said. "This is not factory. Someone has been opening this panel." Repeatedly, they carefully removed the panel. Behind it, the outflow valve assembly looked normal. But the engineers went to work meticulously measuring every component. The verdict came 20 minutes later. "The housing," Benoit announced, his voice grim. "It has been machined, bored out by approximately 2 millimeters on all sides. It is a work of absolute precision. And this," he pointed to the valve itself, "is not the standard alloy. It is a custom fabrication. Stronger, lighter, designed to be removed." He looked at Izzy with a mixture of horror and professional admiration. "Your theory, detective. It was correct. This airplane was modified into a weapon. The trap was set. They had the bodies and they had the weapon. All they needed was the confession." They arrested Captain Julian Croft at his home, in the quiet cul-de-sac, as his neighbors watched in stunned disbelief. They didn't take him to a police station. Izzy had him brought to the secure hangar to the airplane. She met him in the passenger cabin. The plane was dark and silent, save for the hum of the hangar lights outside. Croft showed no surprise, no fear. He walked down the aisle with a calm, almost proprietary air, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked at Izzy, and for the first time his placid mask dropped. He smiled. It was a smile of intellectual superiority, the smile of a grandmaster acknowledging a worthy opponent. "An impressive piece of reverse engineering, detective," Croft said, his voice echoing in the empty cabin. "I truly didn't think you were capable of it." "It's over, Julian," Izzy said, her voice steady. "We found them. We know how you did it." "Do you?" he asked, a genuine curiosity in his tone. He walked to the rear of the plane and stood in the galley, the scene of his crimes. "Knowing the mechanics of a thing is not the same as understanding its purpose. It's art." And then he told her everything. He spoke not with the rage of a killer or the remorse of a penitent, but with the calm, didactic tone of a professor delivering a lecture. He told her about his brother, Daniel, about the chaotic, meaningless accident that had shattered his belief in a just and orderly universe. "The universe is a sloppy, chaotic engineer," Croft explained, his eyes alight with a fervent, philosophical fire. "It allows for randomness, for good men to fall from the sky for no reason. I am simply a better engineer. I impose order on the chaos. I create my own rules, my own physics." He explained how he chose his victims. It was, as Izzy had suspected, completely random. He would pick a seat number before the flight, and whoever sat in that seat was the chosen one. A businessman, a student, a grandmother, a honeymooner. Their lives and dreams were irrelevant. They were simply variables in his equation, random numbers that he, the master of the system, would pluck from existence to prove his own power over the chaos he so despised. "I didn't hate them," he said with a chilling sincerity. "You cannot hate a number. They were simply corrected, removed from the noise. I gave their meaningless, random lives a spectacular, impossible ending. In a way, I elevated them. I made them part of something beautiful." He described the modifications to the plane, a project that took him years of patient, meticulous work. He spoke of the adrenaline, the intellectual thrill of committing a perfect, impossible crime under the noses of his crew and his passengers. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an artist and a scientist, conducting the ultimate experiment in control. "Up there, I am a god," he whispered, his gaze turning upward, as if he could see the sky through the roof of the plane. "I control the thunder and the lightning. I control the fate of the 200 souls who place their lives in my hands. And sometimes, just to prove the order of my universe over the chaos of theirs, I choose one to fall." His confession was recorded, his fate sealed. The trial of the ghost flight pilot was a global spectacle, a terrifying story that forever changed the public's perception of air travel. The name Julian Croft became synonymous with the ultimate betrayal of trust. Months later, Izzy and Thorne stood on a windswept overlook, watching planes descend toward the San Viento airport. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, just as it had been on the days the victims had fallen. "A god," Thorne said, shaking his head. He really believed it. In his world, he was, Izzy replied softly. He built his own reality in that cockpit with its own set of rules. The problem is, when he was up there, he was so high up, he forgot what it meant to be human. She watched as a plane, a silver speck against the vast blue, began its final approach. It looked so safe, so orderly, a testament to human ingenuity and the triumph of rules over chaos. But she knew now that the most secure fortress can be breached, not by force, but by the quiet, patient monster who holds the keys. The world below was messy and chaotic, but it was real. And some people, she now understood, would do anything to escape it, even if it meant pulling others down into the darkness with them.